All right, sticky note number two, we're going to talk about how the mortgages are hitting their trigger rates and what the banks are doing about it. So, first, again, let's set the context, Patrick, which is these variable rate mortgages. They essentially have a range where if the interest rate stays below that, that's called the trigger rate. If it stays below that, your payments are the same. But if you cross that trigger rate, then your payments change, meaning they could jump up significantly. That's one of the downsides of variable rate mortgages. And someone who has a fixed kind of household income, sometimes they can't handle that, rightfully so. And as a result, this can create a lot of havoc for people. Now, a lot of people a lot of banks are now hitting those trigger rates. A lot of mortgage contracts are hitting those trigger rates and have been over the last little bit. But the banks aren't actually increasing payments. They're doing something different. And this is quite unique. And I noticed it on one of my mortgages.
Well, I think there's a few things to consider here. I think the number is actually 75% at least of mortgages out there are hitting this trigger rate, this so-called, or what they refer to as a trigger rate. To your point, all of a sudden payments aren't covering interest. But here's the interesting part of all of that. So when we look back over the past 2 or 3 years, of course, we saw this housing market frenzy. We had Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, governor, look into the camera 3 years ago and go, rates aren't going up for a long time, a very long time. So we joke about that all the time. Like that will live into his profile it'll live online for a lot of years. But the point is this: now they in fact did the opposite of what he said they were going to do, and they more than doubled. Did they not just triple? Like they're up a lot. So the point is this: when we look at what happened with payments, the banks are now hedging their bet, JG, because here's what they're doing. They're kicking the can down the road, and they're not actually passing the increases on to the owners of those property, the retail, to the homeowners. Why? Well, guess what? If they do that, they're going to start foreclosing. They're going to end up with a bunch of real estate on their books that they don't want. So what's literally happening is they're extending amortizations. They're not upping payments. And that's not the case for all banks, by the way, but a large portion of them, like 80% of them, are just kicking the can down the road, which they don't want the real estate. They don't want to have to foreclose on the deal. But here's what's happening for the homeowners. Guess what? They're living into a space where they don't pay down their mortgage at all. And as a matter of fact, if they go into this amortization and things don't change, they could literally owe more money in 25 years than when they started. What? So it's not a good situation for anybody right now, but I understand why the banks are doing it. And I believe that this is going to, it's an indicator of something here, JG. And I know this is a little bit long-winded, but I think there's an indicator here that the banks are going, we're hedging our bet and thinking rates are going to come back down. That's what I think.
Well, that's interesting, and you very well might be right about that, Patrick. And I think it's fascinating that the banks are using this tactic, because I think if you're the average homeowner and you're on a fixed household income and you make whatever you make, 100, 150 grand a year into your household, and you have a mortgage, and like, do you want your payments to double, or do you want to extend your amortization? And your statement about owing more in 25 years, it's a little dramatic, Patrick. But because this won't last forever. But for now, it is a bit of a short-term fix for these banks and for the people. I think it's kind of fascinating. But I had this happen to me because I have a mortgage. I forget how many it had. It had 23 years left on it, I believe, if that's a number. And I opened up my statement and it says, you now have 27 years left. And I'm like, how the hell did that happen? But this is exactly what happened. Is that's what we mean, folks, by negative amortization. They didn't change my payments, which is not a bad thing for me, because at least this way I still retain my cash flow in that particular investment. But now I have to pay it off in 27 years instead of what I had for 23 years. But that will shift. That doesn't get fixed there. That'll shift as interest rates start to shift back down, and then we renew those mortgages. So it's all kind of interesting, Patrick. And I think it's, have you ever seen back in the day, did they do this back in the day, Patrick, or is this a relatively new tactic they're using?
I've never seen it. I'm not saying they didn't do it. It wasn't certainly public like it is today. It wasn't a big topic of conversation. We didn't have a social media back then. We didn't have actually the bank policies that we have today, the demand, all of that. So it's a different time. But I think there's a few things to consider. Number one, not all banks are doing that. And I'm going to make this point. Let's work backward from how do we look at it as investors. So first off, the banks are doing this for a couple of reasons. I think that they look into the future and they go, rates are going to come down and we can get people back on track. I don't think it's good publicity if all of a sudden they're foreclosing on a bunch of real estate that they now hold and have to get rid of. I think that's bad news. If you look at people that are struggling literally now because they did, in fact, see their payments double or more, that's where the opportunity lives. Now, that always sounds a little bit like, oh my gosh, we're taking advantage of people that are in trouble. And I want you to shift that thought process into these individuals are individuals that investors who are savvy, sophisticated, who are thinking through things can go in with an attitude, how can I help you, and actually put deals together. It's a way to look at it and say, this person has a problem. He created it, the banks created, or she, whatever, the family created it. At the end of the day, forget about whose fault it is. I've got a problem, and you as an investor can help me out. So as investors, we want to see these things and be able to grow our portfolio based on what's happening within the economy. That's how we have to approach it. I'm surprised that there isn't more happening, but I think that in 6-12 months, we're going to see a lot more of it happening. We've talked often about the creative buying strategies that we educate, we teach, Barry McGuire and the creative buying strategies programs that he's done. This is the exact time you need those skills and those tools to take advantage of what's happening in this marketplace. So that's what I think is going on. I think it's also a PR move, again, for the banks.
For sure.
With all that's happening, you start foreclosing, and boy, oh boy, people are going to be pissed.
The banks are not equipped to own real estate. They're really not. They don't want this real estate, and that goes for, and we have a very low delinquency rate right now on mortgage rates. We just published that number a couple weeks ago, I think it was, Patrick, a couple episodes ago. I remember pointing out, in Canada's delinquency rate on mortgages is very, very, very low. And this is a big reason why, because we're just pushing out the amortization, which is helping to make sure some people that are on that edge don't default on their mortgage. But you're right, Patrick, about sophisticated investors. Many of those watching this show. That's why we're hosting that upcoming event we're doing at the Rapid Cash program with Barry McGuire in Edmonton, is to teach some of these advanced strategies so that investors can become sophisticated investors. And as a result, they can be problem solvers and help these families that do end up getting into trouble. They still need to get out of that trouble, and us investors can help them with that.
Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, JG, I'm really shocked at how many people are sitting on the sidelines waiting for something to happen, as opposed to being in action, looking for deals, creating deals, looking for opportunities and creating opportunities within the circumstances.
It's because of actually what you just said, Patrick. You just said, you actually just said something interesting. You said there's more of this coming down the line. There will be more deals, but investors somehow, especially the not so sophisticated ones, or the ones that are just starting out, they're always waiting for that better deal. And when you keep waiting for that better deal, there's always a better deal, guys. There's always going to be a better deal down the line. But you know how much money you're leaving on the table by not getting into this deal? You just got to look at that deal and say, if this deal works for me, awesome, let's do it. Let's pull the trigger. If you wait for, there's always a better deal to be had. There's no doubt about that. And there's the same way, there's always a better deal that you missed in the past. And you're like, shoot, I should have done that deal. And you really got to take those two out of the equation as an investor and say, what's in front of me right now? And is that a good deal? If it is a good deal, then pull the trigger and move forward on creating your financial future, because waiting is the worst tactic when it comes to investing. That's for sure. All right. Topic number 2, covered in detail.
If you like what you learned here, go to the description below and subscribe for our free Insiders newsletter, where you can also stay up to date for our upcoming events and our courses.
If you want to see more stuff like this, click here. If you want to see the entire show, click there.